Hello my lovelies and welcome back to my channel. I hope you are having a fantastic day. It is graduate application season. I know I'm a little behind on application season stuff, but I came up with this video idea recently and I wanted to try to get information out to you as soon as possible. So I hope I have some things that might be helpful to you. So today I'm going to be talking about disability disclosure in your initial graduate school application. So just for a refresh, and I'll do a whole video on what my application process was like in the next coming weeks. But just so that you know, graduate applications have generally, you have your statement of purpose, you have your resume or CV, and then you also have your letter of recommendation. You might meet with different departments or department heads, graduate directors beforehand, and that's all kind of the different elements. And throughout that, you have to decide a lot of information, how to disclose and how to maintain professionalism, but when you're disabled, you also have to manage that. So I'm hoping to kind of at least give you my insight to disability disclosure in graduate school applications. If you're new to my channel, my name is Isa, and I am a second-year graduate student in communication studies with a focus in disability culture and identity. In this video, I'm going to first talk, give a disclaimer essentially, and some nuance there so that you can make an informed choice about disclosing your disability to your graduate institutions. And then I am going to talk about the pros, the cons, and then some tips I have for disability disclosure. So with that said, let's jump in. To start off with the disclaimer, I want to clarify that I'm going to be talking about my own personal experience and then also information from articles that I have read from wonderful scholars that I have listed down below in APA citations. So if you want to know more, definitely check these out because they're very fascinating articles. So my disclaimer, I wouldn't be doing my due diligence as a critical scholar if I didn't say you don't owe anyone your private medical information, ever. According to some articles and according to a lot of invisibly disabled people in my life and from my own experience in times of invisible disability, when you disclose your private medical information or say, hey, I'm disabled, there's this feeling of having to defend, like I'm not making it up, I'm not faking it, and providing more and more information. And then also other people tend to ask very invasive questions, and that's even the case with visibly disabled people. You don't ever owe anybody your private information, but with that same thought, you also don't owe anyone making their lives more comfortable when it comes to your disabled identity. You don't have to hide who you are. You shouldn't ever feel like you have to hide. The decision to hide or disclose or share whatever it may be needs to be your decision and making an informed choice. And that's what I hope to be doing in this video, is providing you some information that might be beneficial to you. So to clarify on what I mean by that specifically is sometimes we do need to disclose private information for accommodations. This is in higher education a little different from a traditional workplace from my understanding. So in higher ed specifically, we have lots of different schools will have disability service programs. You will not have to disclose your disability or specific information pertaining to it with anybody except the disability services. Then disability services will talk to or give you the letter to talk to your professors and talk about accommodations specifically, not your diagnosis. Which then is to respect your privacy. Now, that process typically only occurs after you have accepted your invitation to go to the school. So that means in the initial graduate school application process, do not feel pressured into telling people that you're disabled or details of your disability in order to get accommodations later. At any point in your graduate experience, you should be able to get accommodations legally. So just knowing your rights, at least within the United States, that's very important, because I've talked with people who are worried that if they don't disclose initially, that they fear that they're going to lose their accommodations. So beyond that, what are some other complicated elements of disclosure? Well, disclosure is not black or white. It isn't, you disclose or you don't disclose. There's multiple layers to disclosure. There's multiple layers to disabled identities. For example, and I've talked about this previously on my channel, I am an ambulatory wheelchair user, with what I see as the main parts of my disability being invisible with my chronic illness and life-threatening condition. So what elements and how do I disclose those different parts of myself? And so there's never going to be like one right answer, but we're going to try to give you some resources to make the right answer for you. We're starting with the cons because it's a shorter list. However, that list does come with some of the nuance that I just discussed. So the first off is that you are putting yourself at risk for being stigmatized. And that stigma doesn't just occur potentially from the moment that you're or whether or not you're going to be accepted or rejected. It can also occur in your experience in the graduate program. For example, I had an individual who was in kind of a leadership position over me who knew that I was disabled and questioned my ability to teach. And since we are in a position in graduate school where a lot of us are applying for these graduate teaching assistantships, acknowledging that people stigmatize our disabilities and could potentially use that as a reason not to hire us. Is that legal? No. Is it right? Absolutely not. But that is something that you do have to consider when making your decisions on whether or not to disclose or not disclose. Another element of cons that I don't think we think about a lot is that when you disclose in your graduate application or when you first meet a grad director, you could potentially become tokenized in the department. And I'm not saying all departments are like this. I've just seen it happen a couple of times where schools will say, oh, we're super accepting, we're super inclusive, here's this one disabled student, and using that one individual to try to encourage you, a disabled student, to go to that university. And when you talk to people, and sometimes you don't even get to talk to the disabled student, that you find out it wasn't the most inclusive space, and there's a reason there's only one disabled student that they can name. And so kind of like looking out for those things, you don't want to ever be put in a position where not only did you not have a great time at your program because of all of the issues with your disability and the way people treated you, then they're using you as an example of like, oh, here's more disabled people come in. It puts you in an awkward position if they connect you and be like, don't come to the school that I'm at. And it's just something to consider. So again, it's pros and cons. So let's jump into the pros because there's so many. So the first pro is that you can become the most authentic version of yourself, which I find helps me become more confident, helps me when I disclose my disability, I feel like I can talk about different elements of my life because my disability affects every part of my life. And when I don't disclose, if I'm trying to hide all elements of my disability or hide that I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, not just a wheelchair user, I feel like I'm cutting away parts of myself and having to be very particular with the stories that I tell. And in your graduate application, you potentially are going to be telling a lot of different stories. So that's something to consider. Another pro is that you can highlight your specific passion. So for me, I wanted to study disability culture and identity, and there aren't any, if at all, any programs that I could find that specifically focused in disability culture and identity in communication studies. So I had to look for programs that would allow me to study that. So there's, organizational communication programs and there's interpersonal communication programs. And the one that I ended up choosing was one that gave me a great foundation in all of my methods, quantitative, qualitative. So it allows me to play in these different research methods, which ultimately helps me make a better decision if I choose to go on to my PhD in the long run for me. But all of that was motivated and highlighted by my desire to feed back into my community and provide research for my community. Another reason you might want to disclose your disability is that If you had a bad semester, particularly relating to some health issues, you can highlight your story of overcoming. Are there some toxic positivity, toxic like inspiration porn elements in that? Absolutely. But again, we're trying to find ways to engage with the program that, you know, sometimes you have to play the cards in order to get into these very specialized spaces, which is not good, but ultimately they're resources for you to know. So in statements of purposes, they advise that if you had a really bad semester that's different than all of your other semesters, kind of explaining like, hey, I had this health issue, or hey, I had this major surgery, which then ultimately like hurt this one semester. However, I was able to overcome, or I have adapted to my environment, that I have found better ways of accommodating myself and finding ways that I can be successful. Remembering again that element of like, for a lot of people, you're not just looking at an education, you're looking at a job while you're being educated, so you don't have to pay for your school. So those are things to consider. And a lot of statements of purposes, they're looking for guarantees that, not guaranteed, but looking for ways to know that you are going to stick with school, because grad school is very, very hard. And they want to make sure that the students that they let in, especially the students that they fund, are going to stay at the school for the whole year, for the whole program. So that's just some things to consider when highlighting your disability. My final pro, which is very, very rare, but sometimes disclosing your disability can give you the opportunity to find special funding, grants, type of things. Typically that's very, very rare for graduate students, but just in case, there are a few schools that, for example, there's one that I went to their open house, it wasn't in communication studies, that said, if you have a marginalized identity, consider letting us know in your statement of purpose so that we might be able to find you funding, which was really important for this program since they didn't offer very much funding. So trying to find specific ways that they can fund you. Again, it was a very specific school in a very specific environment, but something to consider when looking at graduate schools. So in my graduate applications, I chose to disclose my disability in most of them. However, I adopted some very specific rules for myself when disclosing my disability that allowed me to feel more in control of my disability disclosure. So the first tip that I have is come up with the rules for yourself. For me, it's really important that I disclose my disabled identity and my identity as a disabled researcher over my physical everyday, like this is what my disability looks like to me. Just because of the nature of my research and the nature of who I am, that makes me feel more comfortable with the information that I provide. So if I, as a wheelchair user, I need people to know that I need resources to get into buildings and go places. So I'll disclose that information, but I won't disclose, you know, typically that I have chronic health or I'm high risk unless it becomes a problem, as in the case of COVID. So that's something to consider, and then that way you're kind of disclosing it part. Also, in graduate applications, I think it can be really, really positive experience to go back on some of those pros and highlight the elements of your disability that make you a great candidate, because ultimately something that I want you guys to remember, and I think a lot of people forget when they're applying to graduate school, is that you're not only looking for a school to accept you, you are looking for a school that's going to serve you, that's going to give you a great experience, that's going to enhance your education, that's going to provide you opportunities beyond this period of time in your life. And as such, if you look at schools that are really prestigious, but you don't think that they're going to serve you for whatever reason, that's something to consider, because you're bringing in so much wealth as an individual to these programs. Graduate students, I believe, and I'll have the correct numbers down below if it's not correct, only make up of 7% of master's student or disabled individuals make up 7% of master's students, and I think 6% of PhD students. So acknowledging that role that you play in the greater scheme of higher education is something that I think can be really important, because you're so valuable. I love, love, love hearing disabled people say that they're going into higher education. My experience has not been super positive all the time, and I'll be the first person to tell you that. However, I think the only way that it can get better is if more of us really stick to it and kind of come together and support each other through this graduate application, and that isolation is the greatest enemy. And that's the main way of maintaining like this hegemonic version of graduate school. So I really hope that this information helped you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. I'm hoping to do a couple more videos on disability disclosure and highlighting some of my thoughts on it. I've done a lot of research on disclosure this year, so I've written a couple papers that I would like to kind of bring to you guys and share the wealth of knowledge. So if you like this type of content, make sure that you like and you subscribe so that you can see more of it. See you real soon.